October 21st, 1935, at exactly 7:38 in the evening, inside a quiet restaurant in Newark, chosen not for comfort but for consequence, a place declared neutral ground by the Commission itself, a room where violence was forbidden and authority was supposed to matter more than ego. No bodyguards nearby, no visible weapons, no witnesses meant to speak later. Just two men sitting across from each other with 3 years of blood and resentment between them. On one side sat Dutch Schultz, 43 years old, wealthy, feared, and increasingly unstable. A man whose power came from chaos and whose temper had already buried too many bodies. Across from him sat Bumpy Johnson, only 32. Calm, still, unreadable. A man who understood that real power rarely announced itself loudly. The meeting existed because the war had dragged on too long. Harlem refusing to submit, Dutch refusing to retreat, both sides bleeding money and men, neither winning, and the Commission demanding resolution for the sake of business. 17 minutes passed before the air changed. Dutch leaned forward, patience gone, voice sharp with insult and entitlement, offering partnership framed as generosity, 20%, protection, expansion, an offer designed to sound reasonable while demanding surrender. Bumpy listened without interruption, then answered quietly, Harlem didn't need Dutch's money. Harlem didn't need his protection, and the answer was no. The same answer Dutch had heard for 3 years. That was the moment everything froze. Dutch's chair scraped as he rose. His hand slid deliberately into his jacket, slow enough to be unmistakable. Metal emerged, cold and final. A pistol lifted across the table and pointed directly at Bumpy's face. Neutral ground shattered instantly. The Commission's authority hanging in the air. Dutch's voice dropped into something far more dangerous than shouting. Accept the partnership or die right now. Bumpy didn't move, didn't reach, didn't flinch. He simply looked at the gun and then at Dutch, calm enough to unsettle a man who lived on fear. If you're going to shoot me, but understand this. The moment you pull that trigger, you sign your own death warrant. Not from me, but from the Commission. This meeting was guaranteed. Kill me here and you prove their word means nothing. Dutch's hand began to shake, barely, but enough, because he wasn't stupid, just unstable, and he knew what killing Bumpy there would mean. Every boss in New York turning against him, not for murder, but for breaking the system itself. 10 long seconds passed, then the gun lowered, slowly, reluctantly, disappearing back into the jacket where it never should have been. Dutch sat down, humiliated, furious, exposed, promising death later instead of now. Bumpy stood calmly, the meeting already finished in his mind, told Dutch to inform Luciano the negotiations had failed and that neutral ground had been violated, then walked out expecting a bullet in his back. None came. Inside that room, Dutch Schultz sat shaking, not victorious, not dominant, because pulling that gun hadn't shown strength. It had started a countdown. 48 hours remained. What most people misunderstand about that moment is that the gun wasn't aimed at Bumpy Johnson alone. It was aimed at the system holding New York's underworld together, because the real danger wasn't the bullet. It was where that bullet would have been fired. The meeting wasn't just a conversation between two criminals. It was a commission-sanctioned negotiation, personally arranged and guaranteed by Lucky Luciano. And when Luciano gave his word, that word carried the weight of every family, every crew, every agreement keeping organized crime from collapsing back into chaos. Neutral ground meant something very specific. No violence, no threats, no intimidation. It was sacred space where disputes replaced wars and profits replaced funerals. Without neutral ground, there was no commission. And without the Commission, there was nothing separating business from constant bloodshed. That's why Dutch pulling a gun wasn't just an emotional outburst. It was a violation. a documented breach of authority, proof that Dutch didn't respect rules that applied to everyone else. If he had killed Bumpy there, the damage wouldn't have stopped with one death. Every future negotiation would become meaningless. No one would trust commission guarantees again. Meetings would require armies instead of words. Disputes would return to ambushes and street wars. Law enforcement attention would spike. Profits would fall. Bodies would rise. And the entire structure painstakingly built since 1931 would begin to crack. That's why Bumpy didn't panic. He understood the hierarchy better than Dutch ever did. The gun wasn't leverage. It was evidence. Evidence that Dutch couldn't control himself. Evidence that he was a liability. Evidence that he was dangerous not because he was violent, but because he was unpredictable. And unpredictability is poison in any system built on coordination and trust. Dutch thought threatening Bumpy showed dominance, but to the Commission, it showed something far worse. It showed a man willing to embarrass their authority publicly, willing to turn a negotiation into a hostage situation, willing to make Luciano's word worthless. And that was the real crime, not racism, not the threat, not even the gun itself, but the disrespect, the message that Dutch believed himself above the structure that protected everyone else. Once that message existed, once it could be confirmed and reported, Dutch's fate was no longer about Harlem or Bumpy or territory. It became about whether the system would defend itself, and systems always choose survival. The truth was that the gun in Newark didn't change Dutch Schultz's trajectory. It confirmed it, because long before that meeting, the Commission had already begun to see Dutch not as a problem to manage, but as a threat that couldn't be contained. Dutch Schultz wasn't just violent in the way most gangsters were violent. He was unstable, paranoid, impulsive, a man who heard insults where none existed and betrayal in every silence. Associates whispered that he heard voices, that he trusted no one, that decisions made calmly by others triggered rage in him instead. And instability like that was survivable in street-level crime, but fatal at the top, because organized crime depended on predictability. Dutch had built power through fear and aggression, but by 1935, that same aggression was costing everyone around him money, stability, and safety. He attended commission meetings, but treated their decisions as suggestions, obeyed rules only when they benefited him, ignored them when they didn't. He expanded into Brooklyn without authorization and started a war that left bodies on the street. The Commission ordered him to withdraw. He refused. He killed one of his own men over suspected theft without investigation, later discovering the man was innocent, forcing the Commission to step in and prevent retaliation from within Dutch's own organization. Every intervention cost credibility. Every mistake forced others to clean up after him. Worse still, Dutch openly discussed killing a federal prosecutor investigating him, a line the Commission had drawn in bold ink. Prosecutors brought federal attention. Federal attention brought long sentences, and long sentences threatened everyone, not just Dutch. He was explicitly warned, explicitly ordered to stop, and he ignored that too, because Dutch didn't believe rules applied to him. He believed fear replaced authority, and for years, the Commission tolerated him anyway, not because they trusted him, but because removing him carried risks. Dutch had loyal soldiers, deep operations, and eliminating a boss wasn't something done casually. Chaos had consequences, and the Commission existed to avoid chaos. So they endured him, mediated his conflicts, absorbed his excesses, rationalized his behavior as manageable insanity. But tolerance has limits, and by October 1935, those limits had been reached. Dutch wasn't just costing money anymore. He was threatening the legitimacy of the system itself. Every time he ignored a ruling, others noticed. Every time he escalated violence, it undermined the idea that disputes could be resolved through negotiation. The Commission wasn't worried about Dutch being cruel. Cruelty was common. They were worried about him being uncontrollable. Because an uncontrollable leader forces others to prepare for chaos, and preparation for chaos becomes chaos itself. The gun incident was devastating not because it was shocking, but because it fit perfectly into a pattern that could no longer be denied. It showed that even under supervision, even under guarantee, even when explicitly restrained, Dutch could not stop himself. He didn't just violate rules when angry. He violated them when it mattered most, and that made him something worse than an enemy. It made him a liability, and in organized crime, liabilities don't get negotiated with. They get removed, not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. By the time Dutch walked out of that Newark restaurant thinking he had asserted dominance, the truth was already settled. The commission no longer needed to ask whether Dutch Schultz was dangerous. The only question left was how long they could afford to let him live. The morning after the gun was pulled, while the city moved on unaware, power quietly assembled behind closed doors. October 22nd, 1935. Not in a restaurant, not in a club, not anywhere familiar, but inside a warehouse in Brooklyn owned by one of Lucky Luciano's legitimate businesses, chosen for privacy, for security, for silence. This wasn't a meeting meant to be remembered. It was a meeting meant to decide something final. 7 men arrived separately, at different times, leaving no pattern, no witnesses, no reason for suspicion. Men who controlled thousands of soldiers, millions of dollars, and enough political protection to operate in plain sight. Among them, Meyer Lansky, calm as always, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, Vincent Mangano, Joe Profaci, the commission in full attendance. The room was improvised, folding chairs, a table, bare walls, nothing ceremonial, because ceremony wasn't needed. Authority was already understood. Luciano opened without theatrics, no anger, no raised voice, just clarity. He reminded them why the commission existed, because wars were expensive, chaos attracted law enforcement, and violence between families reduced profits for everyone. The commission worked only if its authority was respected, only if its word meant something. Then he described the Newark meeting, how he personally arranged it, how he guaranteed safety, how neutral ground had been declared, and how Dutch Schultz had pulled a gun anyway. The room went quiet, because everyone understood the implication immediately. The gun wasn't a personal insult to Bumpy Johnson. It was an institutional insult to the commission itself. Luciano made that explicit. If his guarantees could be violated without consequence, then no future negotiation would ever be trusted. Disputes would return to ambushes, meetings would require armed escorts, and the system they had built would collapse under its own fear. Lansky spoke next, methodical, unemotional, reminding the room that this wasn't an isolated incident. 6 months earlier, Dutch had threatened to kill a federal prosecutor investigating him, an act the commission had explicitly forbidden because killing a prosecutor brought federal pressure that endangered everyone. Dutch ignored that order. Costello followed with records he'd been quietly keeping. Dutch expanding into Brooklyn without approval, starting a war that left bodies behind, refusing to withdraw when ordered, killing one of his own men without investigation, skimming profits from joint operations and justifying it as entitlement. Each example added another weight to the same conclusion. Genovese asked the necessary question, whether this was about rules or personal dislike, whether they were judging behavior or personality. Luciano answered without hesitation. Personality didn't matter. Obedience did. Dutch wasn't being targeted because he was cruel. Cruelty was common. He was being targeted because he was uncontrollable, because he embarrassed authority publicly, because he made guarantees meaningless, because he forced everyone else to absorb the cost of his instability. The discussion turned practical. What would happen to Dutch's operations? Who would absorb them? How to prevent retaliation? Luciano had already planned that too. Beer distribution reassigned, numbers operations divided, political connections redistributed, everyone benefited, which ensured compliance. Then the subject of Harlem surfaced, Dutch's personal obsession, the 3-year war no one else had authorized. Luciano was definitive. With Dutch gone, Harlem would be off limits. Bumpy Johnson's control would be recognized not as generosity, but as acknowledgement of reality. This unsettled the room. An Italian governing body formally recognizing a black criminal's territory was unprecedented, but Lansky supported it. Bumpy had defended Harlem successfully, followed rules, respected authority, and most importantly, didn't create unnecessary chaos. The discussion continued for over an hour, not emotional, not rushed. Scenarios examined, consequences measured, risks calculated, because executions at this level weren't reactions. They were resolutions. Finally, Luciano called for the vote. Unanimous or nothing. 7 hands rose, some slower than others, but none objected. The decision wasn't personal. It was structural. Dutch Schultz had become a liability, and liabilities were removed to protect the system. Logistics were assigned, alibis arranged, deniability ensured, and at 11:15 that morning, the meeting ended, the most powerful criminals in America leaving quietly, having just voted to execute one of their own with the detached professionalism of executives closing a failed division. Dutch Schultz was still alive at that moment, still unaware, but his fate had already been decided, and from that point forward, the clock was no longer symbolic, it was operational. When the discussion finally ended, what remained was not doubt but inevitability. The arguments had been heard, the violations documented, the risks measured, and now the system required a decision. Lucky Luciano didn't dramatize the moment. He simply asked for the vote, all in favor of removing Dutch Schultz permanently. No speeches, no justifications, because everything that needed to be said already had been. One by one, 7 hands rose, some confidently, some slowly, but none stayed down. The vote was unanimous. And with that quiet gesture, Dutch Schultz ceased to be a man and became a problem scheduled for removal. There would be no warnings, no second chances, no negotiations, because this wasn't punishment, it was correction. Immediately, the conversation shifted from decision to execution. Not the killing itself, but the consequences. Dutch's empire couldn't be allowed to collapse into chaos. Chaos invited rivals. Rivals invited violence, and violence invited attention. So his operations were divided with precision. Beer distribution reassigned. Numbers, rackets absorbed. Political connections redistributed among those present. Everyone received something, which ensured stability, which ensured silence, power, when managed correctly, leaves no one dissatisfied enough to object. Then came the most unexpected outcome of the meeting. Harlem, Dutch's obsession, the territory he had spent 3 years trying to take by force. Luciano made it official. Harlem would be off limits, permanently. Bumpy Johnson's control would be recognized, not temporarily, not conditionally, but formally. This was not framed as a favor. It was framed as acknowledgement. Bumpy had defended Harlem successfully, followed rules, respected commission authority, and proven himself predictable. And predictability mattered more than race, more than tradition, more than precedent. The commission had never before formally recognized a black criminal's territorial claim, but precedent mattered less than results. Fighting Bumpy wasted resources. Respecting him preserved them, and that made the decision simple. The war for Harlem was declared unauthorized, its continuation forbidden, and any Italian organization that challenged Bumpy's control would be challenging the commission itself. That single declaration did what 3 years of violence could not. It ended the war instantly, without a shot fired, without a body dropped, without retaliation. The meeting concluded with logistics. Contractors would be arranged, alibis prepared, timelines synchronized. Every man in the room would be somewhere public when Dutch died. Witnesses already chosen, stories already written. By the time the chairs scraped back and the warehouse emptied, the transformation was complete. Dutch Schultz still believed himself powerful. Bumpy Johnson had just been elevated, and the Commission had demonstrated its core principle with ruthless clarity. Instability would not be negotiated with. It would be removed. And the man who stayed calm while a gun was pointed at his face had just won Harlem forever. For the next 48 hours, Dutch Schultz walked through New York believing he had won, believing the gun had done its job, believing that fear had finally bent Bumpy Johnson into silence. He didn't know a vote had already been taken, didn't know 7 men had quietly agreed he was too dangerous to live, didn't know that his name had shifted from partner to liability in a single morning. Instead, Dutch moved through his routine with confidence, meeting his accountant about tax problems that suddenly seemed manageable, checking on beer distribution routes he assumed would expand soon, visiting his girlfriend, making plans that stretched weeks and months into a future he would never reach. The irony was cruel and complete. The moment he thought he had demonstrated dominance was the moment he had provided the evidence needed to destroy him. Dutch believed power came from intimidation, from unpredictability, from reminding people he was willing to pull a gun when others hesitated. What he never understood was that unpredictability terrified systems more than enemies. And systems don't respond with fear. They respond with removal. As far as Dutch knew, nothing had changed. No warnings reached him. No messengers hinted at danger. His soldiers stayed loyal. His reputation still opened doors. And the streets still gave him space. He mistook silence for surrender, mistook calm for weakness, mistook survival for safety. Even the Newark meeting replayed differently in his mind, not as humiliation, but as restraint. Proof, he thought, that he could threaten even under commission supervision and walk away untouched. He didn't realize that restraint wasn't mercy. It was procedure. That the lack of immediate retaliation didn't mean forgiveness. It meant preparation. Every hour that passed worked against him. Contracts were being arranged, schedules memorized, alibis rehearsed, while Dutch worried about bookkeeping and logistics. The gap between perception and reality widened with every step he took. By the evening of October 23rd, Dutch still believed the world operated on fear, still believed he controlled the tempo, still believed violence solved problems faster than patience. He walked into the Palace Chop House, expecting nothing more dangerous than a business dinner, unaware that the system he had insulted was about to respond, not emotionally, not loudly, but with final precision. On the evening of October 23, 1935, the Palace Chop House in Newark felt ordinary. Warm lights, quiet conversations, familiar territory for Dutch Schultz, a place he had visited dozens of times without incident. He arrived confident, unguarded by suspicion, seated with his accountant and bodyguards, conducting routine business that assumed a tomorrow. What he didn't know was that 2 men had already been watching him for hours, waiting patiently, measuring timing rather than emotion. Charles Workman and Emmanuel Weiss entered the restaurant at precisely 8:37 that night, not rushed, not nervous, blending into the room like customers instead of executioners. They didn't hesitate because hesitation creates chaos, and chaos was not the goal. Professionalism was. The moment they identified their targets, the sequence began. Weiss moved first, shooting Abe Landau, the bodyguard, multiple times. Landau returned fire out of reflex, hitting Weiss, but reflex was not enough. Weiss absorbed the wound and kept moving. Workman followed immediately, shooting Otto Berman, the accountant. Then Bernard Rosenkrantz, the second bodyguard, each shot purposeful, ordered, eliminating resistance before it could form, There was no shouting, no dramatic exchange, just sudden violence applied with discipline. The entire dining area was neutralized in seconds, and then Workman turned toward the bathroom, the place where Dutch believed himself briefly removed from danger. Dutch was washing his hands when Workman entered. No confrontation, no speech, no recognition, just a single shot to the abdomen, deliberately non-lethal in the moment. Dutch collapsed, bleeding, confused, alive, and that was intentional. Because the goal was not spectacle, it was certainty. The entire operation lasted 45 seconds. Not a second wasted, not a movement improvised. Then both men exited, calmly, disappearing into the city before most patrons fully understood what had happened. When police arrived minutes later, 3 men were already dead. Dutch Schultz was still breathing, mortally wounded, but conscious enough to suffer the gap between power and helplessness. He was rushed to the hospital, surrounded by doctors instead of soldiers, where confusion replaced command. His words drifted into delirium, rambling fragments about soup, harbors, buried money, nonsense stripped of menace, stripped of control. The man who had ruled through fear, now unable to organize his own thoughts. And still, even then, Dutch didn't understand why this had happened. He believed it was robbery, rivalry, bad luck, anything except what it truly was, a sanctioned removal. The shooters were already gone by the time investigators began asking questions, witnesses confused, timelines fragmented, the precision itself leaving little to analyze. This wasn't chaos erupting. It was order asserting itself, violence reduced to a function, executed without emotion, without anger, without revenge. Dutch Schultz lay dying, not because someone hated him, but because a system had decided he no longer fit within it. And the calm efficiency of that decision was far more terrifying than any gun he had ever pulled. By the time Dutch Schultz reached the hospital, the man who had terrorized New York for more than a decade was already gone in every way that mattered. His body lingered, but his authority did not. The bullet had torn through him cleanly, leaving doctors able to prolong life but powerless to restore clarity. Morphine dulled the pain but loosened his mind, and what spilled out over the next 22 hours was not confession or revelation, but fragments, incoherent images, soup recipes, harbors, buried treasure, words without structure or meaning. Some listeners strained for hidden codes, imagined maps, secret accounts, but there was nothing there, no last intelligence, no leverage, no final act of power, just a frightened mind unraveling under blood loss and shock. The myth of Dutch Schultz dissolved quietly in that hospital bed. No last stand, no dramatic speech, no legacy-defining moment, only confusion, fear, and silence. While he drifted between lucidity and delirium, the machinery that ended him moved flawlessly. Alibis were already active. Lucky Luciano was dining publicly with dozens of witnesses. Others were at operas, family visits, casinos, places chosen in advance, places designed to be remembered. Every man who had raised his hand the day before could now prove he was nowhere near Newark. The investigation began as it always did. Police knew it was organized, knew it was professional, but knowledge without evidence is useless. Witnesses contradicted each other, timelines blurred, shooters vanished, responsibility dissolved into rumor, and the commission remained untouched. No statements issued, no denials offered. Silence itself became the final layer of control. Dutch Schultz died the next evening without ever understanding what had truly happened, believing until the end that violence had found him randomly, not systematically, that someone hated him enough to act, not that a structure had calmly erased him. The man who once ruled through fear exited the world without answers, without dignity, without consequence beyond himself. And in that quiet ending, the lesson was unmistakable. Individual power collapses instantly when the system withdraws its protection, and when the system decides to remain silent, nothing follows except absence. When news of Dutch Schultz's death reached Harlem, it didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with relief, because for the first time in 3 years, the war was simply over. No retaliation followed. No successor stepped forward. No new threats emerged. The silence itself was confirmation. The commission had spoken without speaking, and everyone understood the meaning. Bumpy Johnson didn't rush to expand, didn't declare victory, didn't send messages or flex power, because real power had already been granted. The streets changed subtly. Italian crews stopped probing Harlem's edges. Numbers operations stabilized. Protection payments normalized. The constant pressure that had defined Bumpy's daily existence vanished almost overnight. What violence could not accomplish in 3 years had been resolved in 48 hours through structure and patience. Behind the scenes, recognition followed quietly. Doors that had once been closed opened without announcement. Conversations that once carried threat now carried respect. Bumpy was no longer treated as a problem to be managed. He was treated as a partner to be consulted. Italian organizations approached him not as subordinates or rivals, but as equals. Territory was discussed instead of contested. Percentages negotiated instead of enforced. Agreements honored because they were backed by the same authority that had removed Dutch Schultz. This was the true reward, not Harlem itself, but legitimacy, the understanding that his position was now protected by the system rather than threatened by it. Bumpy had proven something rare, that restraint could be stronger than retaliation, that intelligence could outmaneuver violence, that documenting violations and respecting hierarchy could dismantle an enemy more effectively than bullets. The commission respected one thing above all else: predictability, and Bumpy had demonstrated it under the most extreme pressure imaginable. A gun pointed at his face hadn't provoked panic. It had produced clarity. That clarity translated into trust, and trust translated into stability. The Harlem War ended not with a treaty or surrender, but with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that fighting Bumpy was inefficient, unnecessary, and costly. And from that moment forward, anyone challenging Harlem wasn't just challenging Bumpy Johnson. They were challenging the system that had endorsed him, that made him nearly untouchable, not because he was feared, but because he was recognized. And in the world he operated in, recognition was worth more than territory, more than money, more than revenge. It was proof that intelligence, when applied patiently, could reshape power itself. What happened in those 48 hours revealed a truth that most people never learn until it's too late. That power isn't measured by how loudly you threaten, but by how well you understand the system you're standing inside. Dutch Schultz believed power lived in fear, in unpredictability, in reminding everyone that he was willing to pull a gun when others hesitated. And for a long time, that belief worked, until it didn't. Because fear destabilizes systems, and systems respond to instability the same way every time, by removing it. Bumpy Johnson understood something deeper, that information moves more efficiently than violence, that patience creates options, violence destroys, and that calm under threat isn't weakness, it's leverage. When a gun was pointed at his face, Bumpy didn't fight back, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. He recognized that the real audience in that room wasn't Dutch, it was the commission, the structure watching silently in the background. And structures don't respond to emotion, they respond to evidence. Bumpy didn't seek revenge through blood, he sought it through accuracy, by documenting behavior, by reporting violations, by allowing Dutch's own instability to speak louder than any accusation. This is what revenge looks like when it's filtered through intelligence, not retaliation, but inevitability. Systems don't need anger to destroy rule breakers. They only need proof. Once that proof exists, once a pattern is undeniable, The outcome becomes procedural, cold, irreversible. Dutch didn't fall because Bumpy outgunned him. He fell because he outed himself as incompatible with the structure that protected him. Every system has rules, written or unwritten. Follow them and you're shielded. Violate them and the shield disappears instantly. Bumpy's restraint wasn't passive. It was dominant. Because dominance isn't about reacting. It's about choosing the terrain where conflict is decided. Dutch chose chaos. Bumpy chose governance. One burned energy, trying to intimidate. The other conserved it, waiting for the correct moment. And when that moment arrived, the outcome favored the man who understood hierarchy. This is why the most dangerous enemies aren't always the ones who threaten you directly. They're the ones who document your behavior, escalate it properly, and let your employers, your partners, or your system deal with you. Bumpy never positioned himself as an avenger. He positioned himself as reliable, and reliability is currency in any organized structure. The commission didn't reward him because they liked him. They rewarded him because he reduced risk, because he respected authority, because he didn't force them into reactive decisions. That is the quiet philosophy behind survival in violent environments. Know when to fight, know when to wait, know when to speak, and know when silence will do more damage than noise. Revenge through patience isn't slow, it's precise. It doesn't explode. It concludes. And when systems conclude something, they don't argue with the result. They enforce it. Bumpy Johnson didn't win by breaking rules. He won by letting the rules break his enemy. And that lesson extends far beyond crime, into any hierarchy where power depends on cooperation rather than chaos. Understand the structure, respect it publicly, use it privately, and you'll outlast those who mistake volatility for strength. October 21st, 1935. A gun pulled at a neutral table, a rule violated in full view of the system that governed everything beneath it. October 22nd. A quiet warehouse meeting. 7 men reviewing patterns instead of emotions, evidence instead of insults, and voting unanimously to remove a liability they could no longer afford. October 23rd. 2 professionals walking into a restaurant, 45 seconds of precision, and a man left bleeding on a bathroom floor. October 24th. Delirium, silence, death, 48 hours from threat to erasure. That is the full arc. Not coincidence, not revenge, but consequence. Dutch Schultz didn't die because Bumpy Johnson wanted him dead. He died because he couldn't control himself inside a system that demanded restraint. He mistook intimidation for authority, volatility for leverage, and fear for respect. Bumpy lived because he understood something Dutch never did, that survival at the highest level doesn't come from pulling triggers. It comes from knowing who is watching when you don't. When a gun was pointed at his face, Bumpy didn't react emotionally. He reacted structurally. He spoke to the system, documented the violation, and stepped aside while inevitability did the rest. Dutch believed strength was loud. Bumpy understood strength was quiet. One tried to dominate individuals, the other aligned with institutions, and institutions always outlast individuals. This is why Dutch died confused and alone, and why Bumpy walked away protected and legitimized, not because he was feared more, but because he was trusted more. Dutch Schultz thought pulling a gun was strength. It was evidence, and evidence kills faster than bullets.